Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Tuesdays with the Doctor. My name is Elder Annette Barnes, and we want to welcome those who are with us tonight and who may be watching later. This evening, we have a special guest with us to discuss Hygiene Hypothesis. And we hope you will find this information helpful to you or for someone you know. Our speaker will give us a presentation and then take questions afterwards. You can ask questions either by unmuting yourself or putting your questions in the chat during or after the presentation. And you can also, if you want to ask a question anonymously, you can send it directly to me in the chat. So I will introduce our speaker now. Dr. Jocelyn Celestin is an academic allergist immunologist who has been at Albany Medical College for 26 years, where he is currently professor of medicine, pediatrics, immunology, and microbial disease. He is the chief of the Division of Allergy and Immunology and the director of the training program in allergy and in immunology. And Dr. Celestin was trained at Montemorales, Loma Linda, UCLA, University of South Florida, and Harvard Medical School. He has written multiple peer-reviewed journals, articles, and a book chapter on different allergic topics. He is the head elder of the Seventh-day Adventist Church at Kinderhook and has been married for over 40 years to Maud Joachim, who is also an academic physician and current faculty at Loma Linda University. They have two adult children, Arthur Celestin, a plastic surgeon, and Leila Victorian, a speech and language pathologist. And now I'd like to turn the time over to Dr. Celestin.
Thank you so much, Annette, for that very kind introduction. At this time, I would like to share my screen. Okay, can everybody see my slide?
Yes, we can see them.
Okay, and the volume is okay? It's not too loud? Too low?
We can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, good. Okay, I was asked to talk about the hygiene hypothesis. I think most of you have heard about the hygiene hypothesis. What is that, and what is the implication of the hygiene hypothesis when it comes to diseases of the immune system, particularly allergies and asthma? A working definition of the hygiene hypothesis is the observation that there is an inverse correlation between the prevalence of asthma and allergies and early exposure to microbes and naturally occurring infections. So the more infections, the more microbes an infant has been exposed to, the less likely that infant would develop allergies and asthma. That's a very simplistic way to look at it. However, as usual, this is a little bit more complicated than that. Another definition would be exposure to germs, and I would like to add certain germs. And you will see at the end why that certain, that word certain here is important. Exposure to certain germs in childhood helps the development or the developing immune system not to overreact to harmless substances, which is essentially what allergies are. Allergies are essentially an overreaction of the immune system of the body to things, to substances that are harmless. let's say things like cat dander, dog dander, tree pollens. Those things are harmless for the person who does not have allergies. But if somebody has allergies, those substances can make their life miserable. So exposure to germs, to certain germs, has been shown to help the developing immune system not to overreact to those substances. The history of that theoretical construct that we call the hygiene hypothesis was first proposed officially in 1989. In 1989, there was an epidemiologist at the University of St. George in London who published a paper in the British Medical Journal. And the title of that paper was Hay Fever, Hygiene, and Household Size. That was the name of the paper that Dr. Strachan published in 1989. And what he did with his team was to register or review over 17,000 patients born on the week of March 1958. Why that specific week, that specific year was chosen is totally random. But he followed them, those 17,000 plus patients, for 23 years. And what he did was to check them at 11 and 23 years. And what he was looking for is how many of those subjects self-reported hay fever or allergies at 23 and the last 12 months of that year. And he was looking at parents reporting symptoms of hay fever and the last 12 years of their children at 11 years. And the last 12 months of their children at 11 years. And he also was looking for parental recall of eczema in the first year of life when the child was 7 years old. Okay, so essentially, he wanted to know how many of those 17,000 subjects had any objective evidence of allergies over time. So that was the goal. And the results were all over the place. However, there were two things that were constant when they did all the analysis, the statistical analysis. They realized that there were two constant things that were always there, and that were related with the rate or the prevalence of allergies. And those two things were the family size and the position of birth in the family, okay? Whether the family was big, 5, 6 children, or whether or not allergies was reported in the firstborn or the lastborn. So when Strachan and his team checked for that, that's the conclusion they came up with. They realized that hay fever, as reported in those 17,000 patients, was inversely related with the family size. Meaning, if the family is very big, there was less prevalence of allergies, okay? So in bigger families, less allergies. In smaller families, more allergies, okay? That's one observation they made. And the second observation that they made was that the younger you are in a family, the least likely you are to get allergies, okay? So those were the two observations they made. So the study was not designed to find an explanation for whatever they were seeing. However, the parsimonious explanation that they came up with was that in big families, hygiene is a little bit more difficult to keep up with. And if you have multiple kids, you know, they have to deal with the mess of the first one, the second one, the third one, the fourth one, the fifth one. So by the time you get to the fifth child, you know, the hygiene situation becomes a little bit more complicated. So they came up with the conclusion that the more exposure to germs, the less allergies, okay? And that was the origination of the concept of the hygiene hypothesis in 1989 by Strachan. Now, before that study in 1989, there was already an observation that was made by a physician called John Bostock, also in England. In 1819, he read a paper called Case of a Periodical Affection of the Eyes and Chest, okay? So his paper was about a patient who presented typical symptoms of allergies and asthma. And later on, he would call that whole clinical picture catarrhus estivus in Latin, which would mean summer catarrh, okay? And in the United States, the catarrh is called postnasal drip, okay? It's the feeling that mucus is dripping in the back of your throat, which is a very common symptom of patients with allergies. And because Bostock himself had allergies, so he had vested interest in studying that. So summer catarrh. If you know any Spanish, you would know that allergies or postnasal drip in Spanish is catarro, catarro, the same Latin word to describe postnasal drip. So many years before, over 180 years before Strachan, John Bostock had described allergies, and he was a sufferer. But the most important, the most interesting thing as it occurs very often in science, is that when Strachan published his paper in 1989, about 2 years before, there was another scientist called David Parker. David Parker, who wrote a paper also in the British Medical Journal entitled Hygiene Hypothesis of Appendicitis, okay? And in that paper, what he demonstrated is that kids who have all the amenities in the house, like, you know, modern toilets and all kinds of things, have a tendency to develop more appendicitis than kids who grow up in a household where they don't have all those westernized and modern amenities. And in part, the inspiration that David Strachan was having is using the same concept that Parker was using and trying to explain the prevalence of appendicitis. And even before them, before Parker, before Strachan, okay, there was a neurologist whose name was Bird, George Miller Bird. He was a neurologist, and he wrote a whole book about this. And in his book, he mentioned that that disease that we're talking about here, allergies or catarrh estivus, is a disease of the fashionable and the thoughtful, the price of wealth and culture, a part of the penalty of a fine organization and an indoor life. That was in 1876, okay, 1876, over 100 years ago. The idea that people who have allergies are people of more high class, people who live a life perhaps more free of microbes because they have the facilities and they don't have to deal too much with microbes. And Bird also said in his book, Hay Fever or Summer Catarrh, Its Nature and Treatment, the disease is a modern one and peculiar to civilization and of the 19th century, a disease of the male professionals, literary and businessmen. I very rarely have succeeded in finding a victim among those who till the soil, okay? So, and people who till the soil, that's what Dr. Bird said. Now, it is not clear whether or not he did not know anybody who would till the soil, or whether or not the people who are of lower socioeconomic status don't complain in contrast to people who are better off. But that could have been the reason for his observation. But I think there is still some element of truth in what he was saying in 1876. So what was the experimental evidence that supported the concept, that construct of hygiene hypothesis? One thing that happened in 1989, November the 9th, 1989, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, the reunification of Germany is that the people from the East that were living a life that was very difficult under communist regime, when those two people merged together, if you look over time, you would see that as they merge over the years, the incidence of allergies that was much less in the East became more and more as those Eastern Germans became more westernized and were living a more westernized lifestyle. Okay, so that was observed about 10 years after the reunification. And there were a number of studies that were done that were called, the Alpine studies, where they study kids that grew up in the mountains of Switzerland with cows and pigs, and they drink unpasteurized milk. And the incidence of allergies and asthma was shown to be less in kids who live that kind of lifestyle compared to kids who had a different lifestyle. And in Scandinavia and the Baltic states, there were also studies showing about the same trend. One very interesting study that was done was what we call the Karelia study, which was a study on the Finnish-Russian border. So those kids have more or less the same genetic background, but those who were living in Russia had less allergies than those who were living in Finland. And then that was ascribed to be due to the more westernized lifestyle for those children. And a big study that was done was the Parsifal study. Parsifal means prevention of allergy risk factor for sensitization and children related to farming and anthroposophic lifestyle. All those studies shown that same concept, that the more you live close to the earth, close to a rural environment, close to what we would describe as microbe, the less likely you are to have allergies and asthma. And the Pasteur study was a very critical study also that showed that same trend that supported the hygiene hypothesis. One big study that was done is what we call the ISAAC study. The ISAAC study was the international study of asthma and allergies in childhood that started in 1991 and was completed in 2021, over 30 years following kids from different parts of the world. Over 2 million, about 2 million kids, 306 research centers, 105 countries, 53 languages. And that was a huge, huge study trying to look into the prevalence of asthma and allergies in children and what were the factors. This is to show you, this was a study that involved essentially the whole world, here, America, South America, Africa, Europe here, Eastern Europe, and Asia, all over the world. That was a huge study that was done to look into the causes for the incidence, for the prevalence of allergies and asthma. But really what made the hygiene hypothesis acceptable to the scientific community, what made the hygiene hypothesis legitimate was the fact that scientists, immunologists, were able to find cellular explanation for that hypothesis. Meaning that if you were to take kids who were living in an environment where that would be protective from allergies and asthma, you would see also changes in certain cells of their body that would indicate this is the case, okay? I don't want to get into the science of it with you. That would be several lectures. We can spend several days talking about this. But I just want to mention that in recent years, we have understood that the immune system, as it responds to stimuli or to substances, can do it in a Th1 or a Th2 form. The Th2 form is what will cause a propensity to allergies and asthma, okay? So if you take a kid who lives in an environment where they are theoretically protected against allergies, those kids would not have a Th2, but they would have like a Th1 response. I think that's all I'm going to say about this. If you want to talk about more about this, we can talk afterwards, or we can spend more time talking about this, the Th1 and Th2 paradigm. So the Isaac study was in children. The study in adults was what we would call ECRHS study. That's a study of the European community where we're looking for the incidence of asthma in adults between 20 and 40 years. And then 140,000 were initially enrolled, 56 centers all across Europe, okay? And there was a phase 1, a phase 2, a phase 3, but I just would like to tell you what were the conclusions of that study in adults about the prevalence of allergies and asthma. So early life exposure have permanent effect on allergy and asthma, okay? Microbial stimulation may favor a non-allergic disposition. The presence of pets may cause tolerance and non-allergic inflammation. Improved care of mother and child will improve the general respiratory health of the population. And as it has become very clear in recent years, avoiding parental smoking is critical to secure respiratory health and the offspring. And but we still do not know exactly the beneficial microbial stimulation, how that would look like. Okay, so I'll expand a little bit more on this. Okay, so as it occurs very often in science, there are some pitfalls in the hygiene hypothesis. It's not all rosy. There are some studies that have been very well designed that have shown just the opposite of what we are saying, okay? Many studies, and I don't want to go over all of them here, but there are studies that have shown that it's not always true that exposure to a microbial environment is helpful in preventing allergies and asthma. Many studies. I won't go over them. Perhaps the most obvious question that one should ask is that in the United States, for instance, the people who live in poverty and overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, okay, particularly the people in the inner city, you know, they don't seem to be necessarily protected against allergic asthma. Indeed, those patients, those children, for instance, in Philadelphia, and places like Chicago, and East Harlem, you know, those kids have up to 4 times more likely asthma, and they are 4 times more likely to die of asthma. Those kids that are poor and that live in overcrowding situations. For instance, in East Harlem, the asthma-related mortality rate is several times higher than the national average. You know, in Chicago, asthma is the leading cause, you know, of absence of school absenteeism in children because of asthma. So it would appear that the hygiene hypothesis does not apply for those particular circumstances. This is a very different situation than what we observe in other places like in Switzerland and Scandinavia and the Baltic states, etc. A very interesting study that was done recently by Platts Mills, who is at Virginia Commonwealth University. He proposed 5 separate reasons why there has been an increase in the prevalence of allergies and asthma in the last few years. He thinks that the increase in the number of vaccines in childhood that prevented some common infectious diseases. Okay, so there were a number of infectious diseases that were killing children, like polio, like diphtheria. We have been able to eradicate those diseases. Perhaps allergies and asthma is the price that we're paying for eradicating those diseases. An increase in the broad spectrum antibiotics. We use more broad spectrum antibiotics to treat a variety of infections. They were not available before 1955. And since 1979, we have become aware that it's not a good idea to use aspirin in children because they can have a syndrome called Reye syndrome. And therefore, we have used more Tylenol, and Tylenol itself, to certain mechanism, can stimulate asthma or allergies. Also, there have been changes in the way we live, particularly in the United States. You know, we have more indoor entertainment. You know, we have a lot of programs of TV for children. Children no longer play outside, you know, and they do very little physical activity outside, either because it's not safe or because it's convenient for them to just stay indoor, where everything is cushy, they have carpet, and it's more comfortable. It's not the time when I used to go outside on the floor and play marble with my father, for instance, when I was 10, 11. You know, we used to go outside and play marble. It's a different world. And there is also increased exposure to indoor allergens to cockroach, to indoor pets. So Black Mills thinks that those factors may have played an important role in causing the increased incidence of asthma and allergies. So I think what I'm trying to say is that the issue of allergies and asthma is not the lack of hygiene, okay, per se. It's not the lack of hygiene per se, but there may be certain elements that are present when a less hygienic environment is present that can be protective against one developing allergies and asthma, okay? So the key here is to try to figure out what those factors are. And it's not saying that, okay, you know, we don't need to wash our hands, we don't need to be hygienic, and that will prevent allergies and asthma. It's much more complicated than that. It's what are the elements, the precise elements, and a less than ideal hygienic situation may play a role in protecting one against allergies and asthma. Therefore, some alternatives to the word hygiene have been proposed. For instance, instead of saying hygiene hypothesis, some people prefer to say microbial exposure hypothesis. Okay, so that sounds a little bit more specific. Still not very precise, but a little bit more specific. Or it could be microbial deprivation hypothesis. And the very Strachan, in a paper that he wrote in 2014, is suggesting that instead of calling his construct the hygiene hypothesis, and he's trying to deny the paternity for that construct, but nevertheless, he is proposing that that construct be called biome depletion hypothesis. In other words, when we live a life that is very clean, very sterile, you know, there may be elements of the microbiome that we are not exposed to, particularly in early childhood, that may make us susceptible to allergies and asthma. So this is an evolving topic, a fascinating one, and I wish I had more time to talk to you about it. But I'm going to stop there and take any questions that you might have.
Wow, thank you. That was very interesting. It seems like there's no real answer.
That's usually the case.
That's usually the case.
Yeah.
The medical profession is still a practice.
Yes.
Yes. So yes, we're taking questions now. If people want to send their questions in, have a few questions. That's really interesting. You mentioned that it's possible that exposure as a child or as an infant can help affect how that person will develop allergies or not develop allergies or asthma or that type of thing. But it seems like you have to find this balance between too much exposure and not enough exposure. But I found the birth order very interesting. Do you think firstborns have more allergies because they're the ones that tend to be protected the most?
Yes,
at the beginning,
exactly.
right? Okay, so
that was the idea of Strachan and his study in 1989. Yes.
Yeah, that you're trying to prevent anything from coming to the firstborn child, right? Because it's your first one and you're trying to figure it out. So that's really interesting because both my parents are firstborn. I'm a firstborn, and we all have severe allergies. Like,
Yeah.
so it's like, oh, well, there we go, right? um, is it genetic? Like, is hay fever genetic? Can you, if your parents have allergies, will you get it from them as well, possibly?
Yes, there is a strong genetic component, and as of many diseases, allergies and asthma, there is an environmental component and there's a genetic component. If you have identical twins, for instance, from the same parents, one twin may have allergies and asthma and the other one may not, but most likely the two of them will have allergies and asthma. So it's not 100% genetic, but environment plays a major role. And this is where the hygiene hypothesis comes in. If you have family tendencies and then you're not exposed to the microbiome that is supposed to protect you, then you are at higher risk of developing allergies and asthma.
But we don't know where that level is
Yes,
quite yet. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because if you expose too much as a child, then you're also prone to allergies and asthma. That could also happen. It sounds like from what you were saying.
Yes. Yes, but again, I think the important point here is that we don't know yet what that biome factor is. The goal now of research is to say, okay, we can expose a child specifically to that germ, in a form of probiotics or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And then perhaps we can protect that child from developing allergies and asthma. I think the Scandinavians are doing some beautiful studies on that, but we are not quite there yet.
Yeah, so in another Tuesday with the doctor that we had, we were talking about nutrition for children, and one of the things that was discussed was to help, prevent some food allergies is to introduce the child to food, like new foods, one at a time.
Yes.
And slowly, not like all at once.
Mm-hmm.
And that might prevent some of the food allergies that we're seeing today, possibly. So maybe environmental allergies have a similar type of that they might be looking into that similar type of exposure one at a time. Don't just throw them out in the.
At least for peanut, that has been shown clearly. Mm-hmm. The earlier you expose a child to peanut, the less likely is for this child to develop peanut allergy. And then there was that very nice study done where Jewish children from Israel were compared with Jewish children from England. And then the Jewish children in England had more allergies and asthma than the Jewish children in Israel. And the obvious reason was because in Israel, they introduced very early those children to the mamba, which is peanut. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yes, they introduce them very early. They give them mamba.
Okay.
So that was obvious, the parsimonious explanation for that difference.
Okay, interesting. So what about when you get older? You mentioned something about allergies being permanent. Can you have exposure when you're older to try to train your allergies or bring your allergies back into sort of submission, even if you're an adult, to try to get a handle on that?
Yeah, when you give allergy shots, that's what you're trying to achieve. Okay, when you give allergy shots, what you're doing really is to expose that individual to the very things that they're allergic to. And then over time, you can kind of direct the immune response towards a non-allergic, what we call phenotype. So that's what that's what you attempt to do. But more importantly, it has been shown that if you combine those things that that person is allergic to some microbial component, either in the form of DNA or products of DNA of microbes, you can be much more efficient in desensitizing that person. Okay. There are some very interesting studies done at San Diego and at Hopkins showing that people who are allergic to ragweed, for instance, if you combine the ragweed with some kind of moiety, chemical moiety that has a microbial construct, you may be able to desensitize them more effectively.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Have there been studies to determine why the incidence of allergies on the east side of Harlem is greater than the west side?
I don't know of any specific study except for the one that was published many years ago, about 25 years ago, in the New England Journal of Medicine, looking at exposure to cockroach. And those children, cockroach sensitivity was a major factor. I don't know if there's a difference between East and West Harlem and cockroach, but cockroach seems to be the driving factor in some of those kids.
What allergies do they cause?
Cockroaches, environmental allergies, congestion, eyes issues, asthma, all kinds of problems when they're exposed to residues of cockroaches.
Could they cause more sensitivity to things like hay fever or hay
Yes,
or
yes,
other?
yes,
They can.
yes,
Okay.
yes,
They could
yes.
spread those. It's interesting. Do allergies get worse when you get older?
And some people they do, and other people they don't. It varies, and we're still not sure about why that happens. We know, for instance, of the natural history of certain allergic disease. For instance, asthma. Asthma can start in childhood. Sometimes it's not diagnosed. They call it bronchitis. My mother told me that I had bronchitis, but essentially they're referring to asthma. And then by the time they become young adult, the asthma disappears in some patients. And then for some reason, when they hit 40, it comes back. And there are a few people that would develop asthma very late. And we still don't understand why. But asthma should not be confused with other lung conditions such as COPD, chronic obstructive lung disease, and people who are smokers or people who are exposed to cigarette smoke and other irritants or inhalants.
So can allergies change when you change locations or move to a different state or a different part of the country? Or
Yes. Some of my patients who are winter birds go to Florida during the winter, and as they drive up, as soon as they hit the Hudson Valley, they start sneezing. And that happens even before the allergy season.
Wow.
but in Florida, they're perfectly fine. Some go to Arizona. They're perfectly fine. If you were to live in the mountains of Switzerland and the Alps, perhaps you might be protected against certain types of allergies, such as dust mites. They cannot live very well in that environment. So yes, the environment plays an important role. Ragweed is common in the Northeast, but if you were to go to a place like the Bahamas, then you probably be okay if you're allergic to ragweed. If you live in Texas, particularly in the San Antonio area, then mountain cedar might be a major issue, which would make people miserable there. So it varies.
This is very interesting. I'm making notes of where I should move to. Switzerland.
We want you to stay here. We want you to stay here. We take good care of you. We want you to stay here.
So I found it interesting when I moved up here. I didn't have any allergies. My allergies disappeared. But after about 5 years, they developed again. And I was told by a doctor that says, oh, yeah, after about 5 years or so, 3 to 5 years in a new location, you can develop allergies in that location, which I found to be a very unpleasant statement. So I didn't know if I would move every 5 years. So is that the situation where you when you move to a location, you could develop allergies there by the exposure to?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
You can develop new allergies to the new fauna.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, to the new vegetation that's there. It was interesting because the first 5 years I was here, when I would fly back to Tennessee, I had that same exact experience that you talk about. The moment I got off the plane, my allergies hit me immediately.
Yes.
Exactly. So I found that to be very interesting. Yeah. Okay, so it's hard to get away unless you move to Switzerland or Bahamas. Now, can allergies cause, besides congestion and the postnasal drip, the constant an eye issues, the eye itching and all of those types of things, can allergies also cause dizziness and brain fog and coughing and?
Yes. And feeling of water in the ears.
So there can be a lot of different types of symptoms.
Yes.
To allergies. An allergy attack may not look to some people what they would think a normal allergy attack is.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. But when we move to all these different places, what would be the best way to try to expose yourself in such a way so that you don't get these allergies? Like, you can't stay inside all the time, then you'll develop allergies, right? But do we have a path moving forward? No.
We are looking for it. We're looking for it.
Okay. Be really interesting to hear when you find that. You'll be famous. You mentioned appendicitis in one of your slides. Now, how is that related?
Well, the hygiene hypothesis has been used to explain the prevalence of allergies and asthma. However, there are other immune disorders that have been shown to be associated with what we will call the hygiene hypothesis. For instance, things like inflammatory bowel syndrome, has been associated with the hygiene hypothesis as well, just like allergies and asthma. So it's not only allergies and asthma that can be explained by the microbial depletion or biome depletion, but also other conditions that are immune, like autoimmunity, such as inflammatory bowel disease and some other conditions as well. And in that case, it was appendicitis. And that was the inspiration for Strachan to come up with the concept of hygiene.
Okay. Okay, so this hygiene hypothesis could affect more things than just allergies and asthma.
Exactly.
Right? Other things in our life. So I only have one last question. I don't see any others coming up after this. And that is, you mentioned we should continue washing our hands. So
Yes.
Don't stop doing that, right?
Yes,
okay.
Please do.
What about things like hand sanitizer? Are we over, desensitizing ourselves to, being a germophobic, right? Or is using hand sanitizer, could that possibly make things worse on the allergy side?
I don't think so. But I think if you have a growing child in the house, you should allow that child to explore the environment without being too compulsive about keeping them all the time clean.
Super clean.
Yeah, super clean. Yeah. So that's the most I could say.
Okay. No, that's very helpful. That's very helpful. This has been a very interesting discussion and presentation. Really appreciate your time with us tonight. And we want to thank everyone else who has been watching as well and who will watch later. And I just want to let everyone know that our next Tuesday with the Doctor will be with Dr. Louis Oseguera on Tuesday, June 27 at 6:30 p.m. And more information can be found at our website at joyoftroy.org. So have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Annette.